Senate Banking Committee hearing room was filled with the usual tension that accompanied debates of national importance. But today, the air was thicker with expectation. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, the formidable titan of Washington's financial policy, was about to face off with a senator few expected to pose any real threat, John Kennedy from Louisiana. Waters, a seasoned veteran, had been in the game for over 3 decades. She had stared down Fortune 500 CEOs, outmaneuvered corporate giants, and even faced off with presidents. She entered the room today as she always did, confident, powerful, and ready to dominate yet another Republican adversary on live television. This was her arena, and she was certain that her decades of experience and unwavering commitment to financial regulation would prevail once more. She had never lost a banking debate, and this hearing, set to discuss her proposed financial regulations, was meant to be a victory lap, a chance to silence her detractors and solidify her legacy. As she entered, her eyes swept the room, scanning the sea of faces before settling on Kennedy's nameplate. She couldn't help but smirk. To her, he was just another senator, another Southern politician with charm but no real substance, someone known more for folksy anecdotes than a deep understanding of complex financial policy. But what Waters didn't know was that Kennedy had spent weeks preparing. While she had been preparing speeches and statements, Kennedy had buried himself in constitutional texts, legal precedents, and financial disclosures. The worn copy of the U.S. Constitution he carried with him was not just a symbol of his values, it was his weapon, one he intended to wield with surgical precision. When the hearing began, Waters leaned forward in her chair, exuding authority, her voice sharp and commanding. "Senator Kennedy," she began with a patronizing tone, "I'm genuinely curious. What qualifies a senator from Louisiana to lecture this committee on financial regulation?" She raised an eyebrow, clearly dismissing him before he had even spoken. The room shifted slightly, but Kennedy's expression remained unchanged. He didn't flinch, nor did he rush to defend himself. He simply smiled faintly, knowing that the battle for control of this hearing had only just begun. Senator John Kennedy sat calmly at the table, his hands resting on the Constitution laid out before him. Waters' condescension hung in the air, like smoke, but Kennedy didn't take the bait. He wasn't there to play the partisan game. He was there to expose a deeper issue. He wasn't intimidated by the decades of experience that Waters flaunted. The room settled into a palpable stillness, awaiting Kennedy's response. Waters, with her reputation as a sharp, calculating political figure, expected him to stammer, perhaps stutter under the weight of her words. But that didn't happen. Kennedy's voice was steady as he leaned forward slightly. He met her gaze, with calm, unflinching eyes. "Congresswoman," he said, his Louisiana drawl slow and deliberate, "that's an interesting question, but let me ask you one in return." There was a collective shift in the room as Kennedy's demeanor shifted from passive to pointed, his voice cutting through the room with a quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. "What specific constitutional authority gives Congress the power to regulate every corner of American banking?" Kennedy asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Waters blinked, momentarily taken aback. She had expected a flustered response, a moment to assert her superiority and continue with her prepared lines. But Kennedy's question was direct, precise, and it cut straight to the heart of her argument. He wasn't challenging her on policy or specifics about interest rates. He was challenging her right to wield power. For a moment, there was silence in the room. It was as though the committee members were holding their breath, unsure of how Waters would respond. Waters, however, was quick to recover, her face flushed with irritation, her usual bravado returning as she straightened her posture. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice sharp with a hint of disdain, "you've just proven what I've known all along. This isn't about the American people. This is about your need to feel relevant. We're not here for academic debates. We're here to protect Americans from predatory financial institutions." The room stirred with a soft ripple of approval from the Democratic members, some of whom exchanged nods at the strength of her retort. Waters had made her career out of defending the vulnerable, using her passionate, direct style to shut down opponents who dared challenge her. But Kennedy was unflinching. He wasn't distracted by her rhetoric or the shifting tides of the room. He wasn't playing the game the way Waters expected. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still calm, "I'm not here to talk about feeling relevant. I'm here to talk about constitutional limits. The Constitution doesn't give Congress the authority to regulate every single aspect of life. It grants specific, enumerated powers." Kennedy didn't flinch as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the worn, dog-eared Constitution. The soft rustling of the pages echoed in the room as he opened it slowly, deliberately, as though preparing to show his cards. "I've read Article 1, Section 8, he continued, his voice steady. "It lists specific powers that Congress is granted. Powers that include regulating commerce, but it doesn't give Congress the power to regulate every corner of American business. Certainly not every corner of banking." Waters narrowed her eyes, the first signs of frustration seeping through her controlled exterior. She had built her entire career on this type of policy, the kind of regulation that controlled the financial system from the top down. To have that challenged on such a fundamental level was unsettling. Kennedy paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in the room before continuing. "Now, I know you like to lean on the Commerce Clause argument, Congresswoman, but I'd like to remind you that the Supreme Court has also ruled that the Commerce Clause doesn't give Congress the power to regulate everything it wants. It has limits. What I'm asking is simple. Where in the Constitution do you find the authority to create agencies like the CFPB, which are essentially making laws without any real congressional oversight?" Waters' confidence faltered, just slightly, but the cameras didn't miss it. Her face flickered with irritation as she tried to recalibrate her stance. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This was a direct challenge to her authority, and it was playing out live for the world to see. "The Commerce Clause," she replied, her voice rising with frustration, "has been used for over a century to regulate interstate commerce. It's basic constitutional law, Senator." Kennedy wasn't buying it. He raised an eyebrow, his tone remaining unfazed. "That's right, ma'am. But the key word here is commerce. Regulating commerce isn't the same as handing over legislative authority to an unaccountable agency, one that can write rules with the force of law without going through Congress. That's not regulating commerce. That's legislating from an office in Washington." The silence in the room was deafening. Waters could feel the pressure mounting as Kennedy's calm, methodical approach tore down her defenses. The cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing the brief flicker of uncertainty that crossed her expression. She tried again, this time shifting to a more aggressive tone, but it was clear. Kennedy was gaining ground, and the room was beginning to see it. Waters' confidence, once rock solid, was starting to crack under the weight of the questions she wasn't prepared for. For the first time in her career, she was being forced to confront the foundation of her power. And Kennedy, the quiet outsider, was the one doing the dismantling. Senator John Kennedy's question had struck at the heart of Waters' carefully constructed empire, and as the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere in the Senate Banking Committee room grew heavier. Waters, a woman who had spent decades as a financial policymaker with unparalleled authority, was now in a position she had never found herself in before, on the defensive. The air, thick with tension, crackled as Kennedy, calm and methodical, continued his unyielding line of questioning. Waters adjusted her microphone, her knuckles tightening around the table. She had expected to breeze through this hearing, dismissing Kennedy as another lightweight opponent from the South. But now, for the first time in a long while, she could feel the pressure mounting. Kennedy wasn't backing down, and his questions weren't the typical partisan jabs she was used to. He was attacking the very core of her authority, questioning her constitutional justifications with precision and clarity. "Well, Senator," she said, her voice betraying a flicker of unease, "I think we can agree that protecting American consumers is vital. The agencies I've supported, like the CFPB, were created to hold big banks accountable. That's why we have them, to protect families and ensure that corporations don't trample on the little guy." Kennedy smiled faintly but didn't let. her rhetoric derail him. No one is questioning the need to protect families, Congresswoman. What I'm questioning is whether the Constitution gives Congress the power to create unaccountable agencies, empowered to write rules that have the force of law, without any checks from the people or the legislature. The room fell silent as Kennedy's words echoed in the air. Waters' face was flushed with frustration, but she refused to back down. "We've faced crises before," she snapped, "and the government had to act swiftly. That's why agencies like the CFPB exist, to prevent another financial collapse. We've had enough of corporate greed, Senator. You're missing the bigger picture." Kennedy's expression remained unperturbed. "The bigger picture, Congresswoman, is the Constitution. The founders didn't create a system where politicians could sidestep the law and act without limits. They designed a system of checks and balances to prevent just this sort of unchecked power. If we're going to ignore the Constitution whenever we find it inconvenient, then the entire framework of our republic starts to unravel." Waters recoiled, her mind scrambling for a way to regain control of the narrative. She had spent her entire career defending her vision for financial reform, and here was a senator from a small state with little recognition, challenging the very foundation of her policies. She had become known as a champion of the working class, and now this quiet, deliberate man was making her look like someone who had ignored the constitutional limits of her own power. "Senator," Waters said, her voice turning colder, "you're suggesting that every regulation I've supported is somehow unconstitutional. That's not what we're here to discuss. We're here to protect families from the abuse of financial institutions, not to engage in constitutional debates that you and I both know won't get us anywhere. People are losing their homes, their savings. Don't you care about that?" Kennedy leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. The sharpness in his eyes never wavered. "I care deeply, ma'am. But protecting people doesn't mean bypassing the Constitution to create a regulatory regime that answers to no one. The real question is whether Congress has the authority to delegate its legislative power to unelected bureaucrats who can act without accountability. That's what the founders warned against. The Constitution is clear on this point. Congress has specific limited powers. We can't just create agencies at will and give them the power to make laws. It's an abuse of authority." A wave of discomfort swept through the room. Waters shifted in her seat, her hands pressed firmly against the table as though trying to anchor herself to her position. She had never been forced to defend herself like this, not from someone who wasn't directly attacking her policies with partisan rhetoric. Kennedy was using her own expertise against her, forcing her to reconsider the very foundation of her actions. "Senator, this is ridiculous," Waters finally spat, her voice rising. "You can't stand there and tell me that fighting for consumer protection is somehow unconstitutional. What about the millions of Americans who are drowning in debt, who are getting ripped off by predatory banks? You're ignoring the reality of the situation." Kennedy's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not ignoring anyone's suffering, Congresswoman. But there's a reason our government has a system of checks and balances. There's a reason we don't allow one branch or one individual to act without oversight. We don't hand power over to bureaucrats because we think they know what's best. That's the danger we're facing now. It's not just about policy. It's about preserving the rule of law." Waters' expression hardened, but a subtle flicker of doubt flashed across her eyes. Kennedy had planted a seed of uncertainty, and it was starting to grow. For the first time in years, she was questioning her own foundation of power. The word bureaucrat stung. She had spent decades advocating for those agencies, presenting them as the saviors of the American people. But Kennedy's steady, relentless questioning was forcing her to see them in a new light, one that stripped away the emotional argument and revealed the constitutional truth. Kennedy wasn't done. He had prepared for this moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I've read the Federalist Papers, Congresswoman. I've studied the very foundations of this republic. And the founders, the men who created this country, were terrified of this kind of unchecked power. They knew the danger of it. That's why they wrote the Constitution to limit government. And when those limits are ignored, it's not just bad policy. It's dangerous." The room was still. The weight of Kennedy's words hung heavily in the air. Waters' mouth was dry, and she could feel the sweat on her palms. She tried to maintain her composure, but the room had shifted. It wasn't just a battle of policies anymore. It was a battle of principles, and Kennedy was winning. For the first time, Maxine Waters didn't have the answers. She was on the defensive, and Kennedy was methodically dismantling her authority. The ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she was struggling to keep her balance. Senator John Kennedy knew that the key to breaking through the facade of Maxine Waters' ironclad political career wasn't just about constitutional questions. It was about showing the hypocrisy and personal interest behind the policies she so passionately defended. He had watched the way Waters had shifted the focus from constitutional principles to populist rhetoric whenever the heat turned up. But today, Kennedy wasn't interested in her talking points or political theater. He had something much more powerful, a weapon of truth that was about to turn the tide of the entire hearing. As the committee room fell into a heavy silence following his last question, Kennedy reached into the manila folder that sat neatly on the table in front of him. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The cameras were rolling, the world watching, and Waters, who had walked into this hearing expecting a smooth victory lap, was beginning to look more like a cornered animal. Her confidence had cracked, and her usual partisan deflections had failed. Kennedy's calm demeanor never wavered as he slowly pulled out a document. "Congresswoman Waters, let's talk about something a little more personal," he said, his voice carrying the steady weight of a prosecutor about to deliver a damning blow. Waters stiffened. She wasn't prepared for this. The sudden shift in tone caught her off guard, and her mind raced as she tried to predict what Kennedy was about to unveil. She had spent years building a reputation as a defender of the working class, and now here was a senator, someone who had been dismissed as irrelevant, threatening to expose a personal vulnerability. Her pulse quickened, but she fought to maintain composure. "Senator, I'm not sure where you think you're going with this," Waters replied, a hint of unease creeping into her voice. "I've dedicated my entire career to fighting for the American people, to fighting for consumers, to fighting for families, and to fighting for the underserved. My record speaks for itself." Kennedy's eyes glinted with a sharp understanding. "Your record does indeed speak for itself, ma'am. But let me show you how that record is intertwined with something far more personal. Something that involves your family benefiting directly from your political influence." The room was suddenly frozen, the air thick with tension. Waters' face paled as she realized where this was headed. Her instincts screamed at her to stop Kennedy, to interrupt him, but she couldn't find her voice. Kennedy didn't wait for her response. He was already in full control. He slid a document across the table, making sure it was visible to the cameras. "In 2008, Congresswoman, you arranged a meeting between Treasury Department officials and representatives from One United Bank, a minority-owned bank. What you failed to disclose, however, is that your husband, Sidney Williams, owned $350,000 worth of stock in that bank and had served on its board." Waters' breath hitched, and her grip on the table tightened. She had been caught. She tried to keep her composure, but her usual bravado was slipping away in front of the cameras. Kennedy continued, his voice steady and calm. "After that meeting, One United Bank received $12 million in taxpayer bailout funds from the Troubled Asset Relief Program, money that, coincidentally, helped save that bank and your husband's investment from collapse. Now, Congresswoman, can you explain to the American people how you arranged that meeting, knowing full well that your family's financial interests were on the line?" The question landed like a thunderclap. Waters' entire face drained of color, her jaw tightening as the room buzzed with murmurs of disbelief. She had been caught in the web of her own power. For years, she had deftly navigated the political world, using her influence to push policies that benefited the public. At least, that was the narrative she had sold. But now, Kennedy had flipped that narrative on its head, exposing the personal, financial interest that lay behind her actions. "Senator," Waters stammered, trying to regain control. "That's old news. I've already been cleared by the House Ethics Committee after a full investigation. There was nothing wrong with my actions." Kennedy wasn't moved by her defense. "Congresswoman, let's be clear. The Ethics Committee's investigation was not about the fact that your family directly benefited from a multi-million-dollar bailout. It was about whether your actions were legally permissible. But the real question here is about accountability. Accountability. To the American people who have trusted you to act in their best interests, not to protect your family's financial position. He leaned forward, his voice lowering in a deliberate tone. It's not just about the $350,000 in One United stock. It's about the fact that your actions created a direct conflict of interest, an interest that you failed to disclose. And, when you're in a position like yours, that's not just poor judgment. It's a betrayal of the trust placed in you by the people you claim to serve. The room grew deathly silent as Kennedy's words hit home. Waters, once so composed and confident, was now visibly rattled. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table as if she were trying to steady herself against the weight of the moment. The camera zoomed in on her, capturing the subtle tremor in her hands and the flicker of panic in her eyes. For the first time, she was truly exposed. Waters tried to fight back, but her words were rushed, defensive. Senator, I was helping minority-owned banks, not just One United. I've worked for years to ensure they have access to the resources they need. I didn't know that this specific meeting would focus on One United. You're twisting the facts to suit your political agenda. Kennedy wasn't having it. Ma'am, you arranged the meeting with Treasury officials. You knew exactly which bank was being discussed, and your family stood to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars if that bank failed. Either you're admitting to gross negligence in handling a clear conflict of interest, or you're not telling the truth. Which is it? The question hung in the air like a guillotine, and Waters had no response. Her mouth opened and closed, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was out there for all to see. The woman who had built her career on lecturing others about integrity, accountability, and consumer protection was now caught in a web of personal gain and political maneuvering. The cameras captured every moment. The flicker of doubt, the growing desperation in Waters' eyes. She was cornered and the walls were closing in. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together in front of him. He was calm, unflinching. You came here today expecting to intimidate me, Congresswoman, but the truth is, you've been using your position to protect your family's interests, and that, ma'am, is what's truly unacceptable. The room was still. Every senator, every staffer, every reporter in that room could feel the weight of Kennedy's words. Maxine Waters had been a political titan for decades, but in this moment, she was reduced to a shadow of her former self, her reputation crumbling under the weight of undeniable facts. The once unassailable queen of Washington's financial policy had been unmasked, her power and influence shattered by the very principles she had claimed to defend. Maxine Waters sat at the Senate Banking Committee table, her body rigid with tension. The document Kennedy had just revealed felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced, searching for a way out of the corner she had been backed into. But there was no escape. Kennedy's calm, methodical questions had peeled back the layers of her public service, exposing the personal financial entanglements she had hoped to keep hidden. Her career had been built on the idea that she was a champion of the working class, a fierce advocate for consumers. Yet now the very policies she had championed, the same ones she had defended so passionately, had come to represent something far more insidious: the exploitation of power for personal gain. She tried to steady herself, to regain the dominance she had always commanded in such hearings, but it was futile. Kennedy had struck a nerve and the damage was done. As the room waited in silence, Waters attempted to collect herself, but Kennedy wasn't about to give her the chance to regroup. He had more to reveal, and he wasn't about to let the moment slip away. Congresswoman, Kennedy began, his voice low and controlled. You've made a career out of portraying yourself as a protector of the public. You've fought against predatory lenders, corporate greed, and financial systems that prey on the vulnerable. But today we've learned that you've used your position for something far less noble. You've used it to protect your own family's financial interests, even when those interests directly conflicted with the very policies you claim to fight for. Waters' lips tightened as she fought to keep her composure. The sting of Kennedy's words was undeniable, but she was determined not to let him see her crack. "I've fought for the little guy, Senator. I've done more for working families than you'll ever understand. You're twisting my record. You're attacking me personally, to distract from the real issues." Kennedy shook his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ma'am, I'm not attacking you personally. I'm simply pointing out that the policies you've championed, the ones you've spent decades selling to the American people, are built on a foundation of hypocrisy. You've used your influence to benefit your family, while claiming to fight for the people who need help the most. And that's what's unacceptable." The room was electric with tension. The silence that followed Kennedy's words was suffocating. It was as if the entire Senate Banking Committee had held its collective breath, waiting for Waters to respond. But the response that came wasn't the one she had planned. Instead, it was one of desperation, a last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative that was rapidly slipping away from her. "I've spent my entire life fighting for what's right," Waters said, her voice rising with indignation. "I've fought for families who are struggling. I've fought to make sure that banks can't take advantage of people who don't have a voice. You can't just dismiss my entire career because you want to score political points. You don't know what it's like to fight on the front lines for the people who need help the most." Kennedy didn't flinch. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to Waters' mounting frustration. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice steady, "I respect your passion. I respect your commitment to the working class. But passion and commitment don't justify a lack of accountability. You cannot use your position of power to benefit yourself and your family while telling the American people that you're working for them. That's not public service. That's a betrayal of the trust placed in you by the people who elected you." Waters opened her mouth to respond, but her words caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of Kennedy's words pressing down on her. For the first time in her career, she didn't have the answers. She didn't have the talking points. She was out of her depth. Kennedy, sensing her vulnerability, leaned forward, placing both hands on the table in front of him. His gaze never wavered from Waters. "You asked for this moment, Congresswoman. You asked for the spotlight, for the chance to show the American people that you were doing right by them. But now, you're being forced to face the truth about your actions, the truth about your influence, and the truth about the way you've used your power to protect your own financial interests." Waters, now visibly shaken, struggled to maintain her composure. She had built a career around her ability to dominate these hearings, to bend opponents to her will. But now, she was the one being bent. The weight of Kennedy's words was too much to bear. "You think you can just come in here and tear down everything I've built?" Waters shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "You think you can tear down decades of work just because you don't like the way I've fought for people who need help?" Kennedy's voice was calm, unflinching. "I'm not tearing down your work, Congresswoman. What I'm tearing down is the idea that you can use your position to enrich yourself while claiming to fight for the people. What I'm tearing down is the notion that your power is untouchable, that you can skirt accountability because of your reputation. You're not above the law, Congresswoman. You're not above the Constitution." For the first time, Waters didn't have a response. She could feel the room closing in on her, the eyes of the committee members, the cameras, and the public all focused on her. She had been exposed. Her political empire, built on years of navigating Washington's complex systems of power, was crumbling before her eyes. Her career, once unassailable, was now hanging by a thread. Kennedy's eyes softened, but his words were as sharp as ever. "The truth is, Congresswoman, the American people deserve more than empty promises. They deserve leaders who will stand by the principles this country was founded on. Leaders who will be held accountable no matter how long they've been in power. And today you're being held accountable." Waters looked down at the table, unable to meet Kennedy's gaze. The fight had gone out of her. For the first time in her career, she realized that she had been defeated, not by a more powerful opponent, but by the very principles she had long claimed to uphold. And as the cameras continued to capture the moment, it became clear to everyone in the room. The quiet senator from Louisiana had won, and the once untouchable Congresswoman had been exposed for the world to see. Kennedy's voice rang out once, more, this time addressing the room. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his tone unwavering. "No one is above the law. Not me, not you, not anyone. And when we forget that, we risk losing the very republic we've worked so hard to protect." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Waters, who had entered the hearing with such confidence, was now a shadow of her former self. Kennedy, with his calm demeanor and unshakable commitment to principle, had not only defeated her in this debate, he had exposed the heart of the problem with Washington's power structure. And in doing so, he had reminded the American people of the one thing they could always count on: accountability. The Senate Banking Committee hearing room was quiet now, but the tension in the air lingered. Maxine Waters sat at the table, still trying to regain her composure, but her hands trembled slightly, her fingers clenching tightly around the edge of the table, as if trying to anchor herself to some semblance of control. For the first time in her career, she was unsure of what to say, unsure of how to salvage her reputation in the face of undeniable facts. She had walked into this room expecting a victory, a chance to reinforce her legacy as a powerful defender of financial reform. Instead, she had found herself exposed, her personal financial interests laid bare by a man she had dismissed as an outsider, a political lightweight. Across from her, Senator John Kennedy sat calmly, his hands folded in front of him. His demeanor hadn't changed since he first began questioning her. He was as unflappable now as he had been when the first challenge was issued. His quiet confidence had proven more than a match for Waters' decades of experience, and as the hearing drew to a close, it was clear that he had won, not just the battle of ideas, but the battle for accountability. "Congresswoman," Kennedy said, his voice breaking the silence, "you've been in Washington for over 3 decades, building a reputation for yourself as a fighter for the working class. But today, the truth came to light. Your policies, your power, your influence, it's all been built on a foundation of personal gain. And the American people deserve better than that. They deserve leaders who will be held accountable, who will put their interests ahead of their own." Waters' lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. The words had been stripped from her. She had spent her life navigating the complexities of Washington, carefully crafting her public persona as a champion of the people. But now, Kennedy's patient, methodical questioning had revealed the truth behind the curtain. It wasn't just the policies she had fought for. It was her own financial interests that had been at stake all along. The room was filled with quiet murmurs as members of the committee began to stir, exchanging glances. Some looked at Waters with pity, others with judgment. The cameras, which had captured every moment of the exchange, were now focused on Waters' defeated posture, the once unassailable queen of banking policy now reduced to a shadow of her former self. Kennedy didn't seem to notice the shifting atmosphere around him. He was focused, his eyes steady, his resolve unwavering. He had prepared for this moment for weeks, studied the facts, the laws, the constitutional principles, and now, in front of the nation, he was delivering the lesson he had set out to teach. The foundations of unchecked power had been exposed, and he wasn't going to let that moment slip away. "The truth is," Kennedy continued, "that this moment is bigger than just you, Congresswoman. It's about the system. It's about the principles this country was founded on. The Constitution wasn't written to give anyone unlimited power. It wasn't written to give us the ability to do whatever we think is best for the people. It was written to make sure that power has limits, that we are all held accountable, and that we never forget that no one is above the law." His words hung in the room, settling in the minds of everyone who had been watching, both in the room and across the country. This wasn't just about one woman's political downfall. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire system. A reminder that those who wield power must be held accountable to the people, and that those who use their power for personal gain will eventually be exposed. Kennedy turned to the committee, his voice gaining strength as he addressed them directly. "We've all heard the old saying, a power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've seen it happen here in this room, in this very hearing, and we've seen how unchecked power can be used to protect not the people but the people in power. But today we've also seen what happens when that power is confronted, when the truth is allowed to rise to the surface. Today we've taken a step toward restoring accountability. Waters didn't respond. She had no words left. The cameras captured her slumped posture, the defeat on her face as the weight of her actions, and the consequences, settled in. She had spent her career manipulating the system to serve her own interests, and today, that system had turned on her. It wasn't just the media that had exposed her, it was her own failure to adhere to the very principles she had long claimed to defend. She had been so consumed with her power that she had lost sight of the truth. As the hearing drew to a close, the committee members began to file out, but the weight of the moment still lingered in the room. Waters remained seated, her eyes fixed, on the table in front of her. Kennedy, however, stood up, his posture straight, his confidence unshaken. He had won the day, but he knew that the battle for accountability was far from over. This was just one small victory in the larger fight to restore integrity to the halls of power. Before leaving the room, Kennedy turned to address the cameras one last time, his voice ringing with resolve. This isn't about partisanship, folks. It's about ensuring that our government works for the people, not for the powerful few. It's about making sure that no one, no matter how long they've been in power, can escape accountability. This is the lesson we must all remember, that in America, we are all equal under the law. As Kennedy left the room, the cameras continued to roll, capturing the moment for the world to see. The American people had witnessed a political reckoning, and the message was clear. When power is unchecked, it will be challenged. The Constitution is not a tool for personal gain, but a foundation that holds leaders accountable. Waters sat motionless, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her as she watched Kennedy walk away from the table. The game had changed. The empire she had built had crumbled, and the battle for the soul of Washington was far from over.